Hello and welcome back to another season of Exploring Standards. I am your host, Jess, and we are super excited to be back here with season 4 of Exploring Standards. And today we have a new guest on the show, which I'm really excited about. We are talking to Sandra Chalhoub. And Sandra is an expert in ISO 22000, which is the food management standard. Sandra, how are you today?
I'm very good, Jessica. Thank you for having me today.
Fabulous. Thank you for joining me on the show. This standard we haven't talked about before on Exploring Standards. So I'm really excited to get into it. We're going to be talking about what ISO 22000 is, how it fits in with other food safety standards, and then also like the practical tips of getting started. But as always, I like to give my guests a chance to introduce themselves before we get into the juicy bits. So Sandra, can you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a quality and food safety professional specializing mainly in ISO 22000, HACCP, and food safety management system. I've worked as a QA, QC, and like different types of food businesses. And then I started working as a consultant, ISO 22000 consultant. So I've worked with many different types of backgrounds. And currently, I'm working as a self employed consultant in the UK.
Fabulous. Loads of experience then, which
Yes.
is amazing. Yeah.
Yes.
Let's get straight into it then. So, as I said, our episode is about ISO 22000. So, what is it and why does it matter?
ISO 22000 is the international standard for food safety management system. It provides a structured standard for identifying, evaluating, and monitoring food safety hazards across the entire food supply chain. It combines the traditional HACCP principles with the modern management system concepts, such as risk based thinking and top management commitment, communication, and many other concepts. It matters because food supply chain today is more complex and more global and more vulnerable to disruption than ever. So ISO 22000, it helps ensure consistent food safety practices, and it helps strengthen customer trust, and it helps meet legal requirements. And because the standard is designed for every step in the food chain, then it provides a level of flexibility and a level of scalability that many other standards simply do not offer.
Fabulous. Thank you. I think when you talk about the importance and that why it matters, talking about how global now food supply is, and how complex it can get, I can understand how having a framework that can be applied across, globally works. So then what are the current challenges of in global food supply chain that makes ISO 22000 especially relevant?
Yeah, so food supply chains are facing increasing challenges from climate change, from globalization, and from shifting customer expectations. So
Hmm.
let's start with the first, and in my opinion, the most crucial one, the more crucial challenge, which is the climate change, which leads to disruptions,
Hmm.
extreme conditions, whether droughts, whether flooding, whether heat waves, they are directly affecting the availability, the quality, and the cost of raw material. So when an organization finds itself like dealing with a sudden change of raw material or a sudden change of supplier, this will ultimately increase the risk of food safety. And
Hmm.
this is where ISO comes in handy because it helps prepare the organization with a structured approach on how to handle uncertainties and how to handle sudden changes. The second challenge would be the globalization and the global nature of ingredient sourcing. So you can find that ingredients may pass through many levels of many countries and many operators before reaching the manufacturer. And this will increase the risk of contamination, mislabeling, or fraud. So again, ISO 22000 helps them with a structured approach to deal with these uncertainties and these challenges.
Thanks for that. So obviously, there are so many challenges, and it's fantastic that obviously we can use the ISO standards to help minimize those. So like
Yeah.
you said earlier, which I'd like to bring back up again, is that you said that the standard was scalable in terms of the small to larger food manufacturers. How does implementation differ then if, you're doing it for a small business compared to a large business?
Okay, so the ISO 22000 standards remain the same. The principles are the same regardless the size of the organization, but the way it is implemented can differ from big organizations to small organizations. So in small businesses, you often find that they have limited resources. So you
Hmm.
can see one person handling multiple responsibilities. So this is where, for example, the training becomes and awareness, they become very crucial, because like one person, if he skips a step or misunderstands a control measure, you can see that the impact is very direct. And simply because you have fewer layers of supervision. But ISO 22000 works very well for small organization because it can be tailored to the way they already operate.
Hmm.
Now, in larger manufacturers or operations, the system will ultimately and naturally become more complex because they have more departments, more processes, more trainings to do. So larger companies must coordinate between different departments from production to HR, logistics, maintenance. So ISO 22000 help bring all these functions together under one unified, structured, and systematic approach.
Okay, that's really interesting. Obviously, as you
Yeah.
said, the principles stay the same, but actually how you implement it, obviously slightly different. And naturally, as you said, the larger organizations, it's going to be more complex, which, that
Yeah.
makes sense. So let's think about then, what are the most important first steps an organization must consider when they begin their ISO 22000 journey?
Yeah, so the first and most important step is to secure a genuine top management commitment, because ISO 22000 is not only an operational exercise or a technical exercise, but it's a cultural one.
Hmm.
And without securing a genuine top management commitment, the system cannot function effectively. So this is the first step you have to secure. And then you have to define the scope of the system. And then you have to build a disciplinary food safety team, because the food safety is not only the responsibility of the quality department, it
Hmm.
also includes the production department, the HR department, the logistics department, and many other departments. So, so you build a multidisciplinary team. After that, you have to conduct a gap analysis, which helps you identify and position yourself for where you stand against the standard, what the company is already doing well, and the areas that needs to be developed. So once you have these foundations in place, you can go ahead and start by establishing the prerequisite programs, developing the HACCP plan, monitoring processes, communication, and many other steps, until you have, and all of these steps combined together will help bring the system to life.
I love that. Thank you. And I think your
Yeah.
first point when you said about, getting top management involved because
Yes.
it's a cultural thing, is just so important, isn't it? Because
Yes.
these standards are made to work with your company, not just, it's not supposed to come in and disrupt everything, and having
Yes.
that culture in there and top down, just, I think
Yes.
you're right. It helps so, so much. That's
Yes.
fantastic. One thing that we have noticed is that ISO 22000 isn't widely adopted in Europe. So why do you think that is? And are there any industry or regulatory factors that make other standards more popular?
Yes, I think that the adoption factors in Europe are heavily influenced by market expectations. So you find that major retailers in Europe often require a GFSI recognized standard, because ISO on its own, ISO 22000, is not GFSI recognized. And this is one of the reasons why they often choose to go with a GFSI recognized standard.
Okay.
Another reason I think would be the strong regulatory baseline in Europe, because many companies, they feel that already by abiding and by abiding with the regulatory requirements, so they are already, this is already providing them with a robust structure. You can also find that smaller UK producers, they often adopt the SALSA standard simply because it aligns with local retailers' requirements.
Mhm.
However, ISO 22000 remains incredibly valuable because it is flexible, it is scalable, and it is internationally recognized. And it is much more accessible for small to medium businesses than the highly prescriptive GFSI recognized standards. I would like to add to that ISO 22000 is the foundation of FSSC 22000, which is by itself GFSI recognized. The only missing parts from ISO 22000s are the sector specific PRPs and few additional FSSC 22000 requirements related to food fraud, food defense, allergen management, environmental monitoring. So many companies, they can start with the ISO 22000 as a stepping stone, and then they can later upgrade to the FSSC 22000 with minimal efforts.
Okay, that's really
Yeah.
interesting. So obviously you've just mentioned some of the other standards, so such as FSSC 2000s. Obviously, we've already talking about ISO 22000 in the UK, and there's also systems like SALSA, which you mentioned. So how do all these standards differ?
Okay, so I'm going to start with the ISO 22000.
Yep.
As we mentioned before, ISO 22000 is the most flexible and the most scalable of the systems. First, because it can be applied to every part of the food supply chain, from
Hmm.
farming to producers to logistics to all the way to catering. So it can be applied to every part of the food chain. And second, because it allows the use of OPRPs, operational prerequisites, which are prerequisites that are specific to a certain type of operation. And these OPRPs simply do not exist and are simply not needed in other manufacturing style focused standards. Now let's go to the FSSC 22000. The FSSC 22000, as we mentioned before, it is based on ISO 22000 with few additional requirements that are like, first of all, you have the sector specific PRPs and additional requirements such as food fraud, food defense, auditor competence, environmental management. This is what makes FSSC GFSI recognized. Now, the BRCGS, which is a UK standard, is highly prescriptive and it is primarily designed for food manufacturers, packaging manufacturers, storage, and distribution. It includes very detailed requirements regarding to zoning, personal flow, segregation, which makes it an excellent standard for factories who already have like fixed production lines, permanent zoning, but it does not work well for all sectors. For example, restaurants and catering, they often cannot realistically meet the requirements of the BRCGS because their menus keep on changing. They don't have that structural design like factories. This
Hmm.
is where the ISO 22000 fits them perfectly because it can be tailored to their specific operation. And SALSA is a UK specific standard. It is simpler than ISO, but it is not internationally recognized.
Okay. Okay, that's
Yes.
interesting because obviously I know it's in the UK, but if it's not internationally recognized, it can make that a bit more trickier.
And I would like to add a gap that I noticed in the UK market for the catering sector,
Hmm.
because you would often find that the catering sector in the UK, they are already meeting the legal requirements, which require them establishing PRPs, creating the HACCP plan, managing allergens, traceability. But they are doing most of the ISO 22000 work without actually acquiring a certificate, which will add to them, like, which will give them more credibility. It will increase the customer trust, basically. So they are doing most of the work required by ISO 22000 without actually acquiring the certificate. I think this is a huge gap in the UK market.
Oh, that's really, really interesting.
Yes,
Obviously, that, as you said, they're currently doing most of the work anyway.
yeah,
And as we know, having this certificate kind of really does add value to your organization. So,
yes.
something for those people to bear in mind. Um, right. So we have talked a lot about standards at the moment, but I would like to move on to legal requirements. And you have talked about it, the HACCP, which is a legal requirement in Europe. So, how does ISO 2000 help organizations meet HACCP obligations? And also, can you give us an example integration in practice?
Yes, so ISO 22000 fully integrates HACCP within a complete management system. It does not treat HACCP as a standalone document, but it embeds it into validation, verification, monitoring, traceability, um, and it helps a HACCP, and it makes sure that the HACCP plan remains accurate and remains updated, remains verified, and remains effective. For example, a ready-to-eat salad producer,
Mhm,
um, which has already which is who is ISO 22000 certified, and so he might identify, let's say, the washing and sanitizing step as a critical point within the HACCP plan,
mhm,
and having ISO 22000 will help him not only identify the critical control point and establish control measures, but it will help him strengthen this critical control point by adding validation to it, by adding verification, by adding continuous improvement, by adding communication. So ISO 22000 actually elevates HACCP from just a compliance tool to a dynamic safety system standards.
okay, that's really interesting. Obviously, it
Yes.
sounds like ISO 22000 like just really elevates it and kind of also you need to meet these HACCP obligations, in Europe.
Yeah.
And then 20001 is really just kind of bringing that home. So, moving on to our next bit, and that we want to think about what are some of the most common mistakes organizations make when implementing ISO 22000.
Yeah. So I would say that one of the most common mistake is overcomplication. Organization would often write excessive documentation or overly complex processes simply because they believe that the standard requires it.
Hmm.
But in fact, ISO 22000 is more effective when it's built around the reality of the operation. So ISO 22000, if implemented correctly and built around the reality, it should support your operation rather than overwhelming it.
Hmm.
Another mistake would be, establishing weak PRPs, not doing enough training. Yeah, so there are many mistakes that you can do, but what most importantly, you should create the system around your reality. See what's already happening on the floor, and build the system around that.
I love that piece of advice.
Yeah,
Building it around what's already happening because
yeah,
if something's working well and it meets the requirements, let's not change it. That's just
yes,
making more work, and we don't want to be
yeah,
doing that. That's
exactly.
fantastic. So, moving on to our final question, and that is if you could give one piece of advice to an organization starting ISO 22252 tomorrow, what would it be?
Okay. So my advice would be to truly understand your processes, truly understand your hazards before writing any documentation. Because as we mentioned before, you have to build your system around your operation. You have to understand
Mhm,
your operation. You have to understand your hazard, and then you can start building your system around that. This is the only way how you can have an effective system, and a system that works for you rather than working against you and overwhelming you.
Okay, that's fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah.
So Sandra, thank you so much for joining me on the show today. It's been a really interesting episode, and I think it's been really beneficial to sort of learn about the differences in the standards that we have here within the UK, and then also how ISO 22000 is so global, and how it also helps you meet the European requirements.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah.
And to our listeners, thank you for listening today. We do really appreciate it. If you have enjoyed the show, please make sure you rate, review, and subscribe. It really does help the podcast. I will be back with an episode in a couple of weeks, but in the meantime, stay safe. Okay.